Pick one wife, the other will be executed now. The marshal's voice thunders through the dusty street. The mountain man stands frozen, two frightened women clinging to him as the church bell tolls noon. Deputies rattle their keys, a rope sways in the wind, and the crowd leans forward, waiting to see which life he will sacrifice. But instead of choosing, he does something no one expected. With dust swirling and tempers rising, he makes a shocking stand that could cost him everything. Yet the noose isn't the only danger. A hidden treaty, a railroad's hunger for land, and a secret the lawman prays will never come to light. These twist the story into something far deadlier. The town holds its breath. Guns, faith, and family will collide before sundown. So when the law demands blood, and mercy means breaking every rule, what will the mountain man risk to save both women? And what will it cost him in the end? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Bluff's dusty main street as James McGraw guided his tired mule toward the heart of town. The wooden storefronts loomed silent, but dozens of eyes watched from behind curtained windows and between weathered boards. The clip-clop of hooves and creak of wagon wheels seemed thunderous in the heavy quiet. Maria Santiago walked steadily beside James, her head held high despite the hostile stares. In the wagon bed, Keisha Turner huddled beneath a worn blanket, trying to make herself smaller as whispers followed their progress down the street. "Ain't natural," someone muttered. "Mountain man with 2 women." James kept his eyes forward, but his jaw tightened. He'd known bringing both women to town would cause talk, but they needed supplies and shelter before winter set in. The approaching sunset painted the hills gold, but brought no warmth to the cold reception they received. As they passed the Silver Dollar Saloon, boot heels clicked on wooden planks. Marshal Silas Drennan emerged from the batwing doors, his silver badge catching the fading light. 2 deputies flanked him, hands resting on their gun belts. "Well, well," Drennan drawled, descending the steps. "If it ain't the Hermit of Thunder Mountain come down to civilization at last." His eyes slid past James to Maria, then to Keisha's huddled form. "And brought some interesting company." James drew the mule to a halt, positioning himself between the marshal and the women. "Evening, Marshal. Just passing through for supplies." "That's so?" Drennan's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "Seems to me you're harboring known criminals, McGraw. That Mexican woman there's been seen helping Apache raiders slip across the border. And the other one," he jerked his chin toward Keisha, "she's wanted for harboring fugitives up north." Maria's spine stiffened. "I have never aided raiders. My husband was an Army scout who died serving this territory." "Convenient story," Drennan sneered, "and mighty hard to verify seeing as he's dead." By now, a crowd had gathered at a cautious distance. James could feel the tension building like storm clouds before lightning struck. His hand ached to reach for his rifle, but he kept it steady at his side. "Marshal," he said quietly, "these women are under my protection. They've done nothing wrong." Drennan's face hardened. "Protection, is it? Well, territory law's clear about that sort of arrangement. 1 man, 1 wife. So here's how it's going to be." He drew himself up, voice carrying to the crowd. "You pick one to claim as your legal wife, the other one hangs by sundown for their crimes." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Keisha whimpered softly, while Maria's hand found James's arm, squeezing tight. James felt ice in his veins, but his voice remained steady. "That's murder, Marshal, and you know it." "That's the law," Drennan shot back. "Make your choice, McGraw." "Which one lives?" The crowd pressed closer, hungry for his answer. James looked at Maria's proud face, at Keisha's terrified eyes, and knew there was only one path forward. He reached out, taking both women's hands in his. "According to Silver Blufftown Charter, Article 7, James said clearly, any union blessed by a minister or judge and witnessed by 3 townsfolk is considered legal and binding." He raised their joined hands. "I claim them both as my wives, under that law." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Drennan's face darkened with rage, but James pressed on. You want witnesses? There's more than 30 people watching right now. You want it legal? Get the minister. We'll do it proper, right here, right now. You can't, Drennan spluttered. I can, James cut in. Unless you're saying the town charter doesn't apply anymore? The crowd began to murmur, some nodding thoughtfully. James had spent years guiding cattle drives through Silver Bluff. He knew the laws, knew the people. More importantly, they knew him as an honest man. Drennan's hand twitched toward his gun, but with so many witnesses he couldn't act without cause. His lips pulled back in a snarl. This ain't over, McGraw, he spat. You mark my word. The marshal spun on his heel and stalked away, his deputies trailing behind like whipped dogs. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse, though the whispers grew louder. James didn't move until Drennan was out of sight. Let's find somewhere quiet, he murmured to the women. Old Joe Cooper, who'd known James since his guiding days, approached cautiously. Got an empty shack out back of my store, he offered. Ain't much, but it's yours if you need it. Much obliged, Joe, James said softly. They led the mule around to a small wooden structure behind Cooper's general store. It was simple, one room with a pot-bellied stove and some basic furniture, but it would serve for the night. James helped Keisha down from the wagon while Maria gathered their few belongings. Inside, a single kerosene lamp cast flickering shadows on the rough walls. They moved in silence, each lost in thought as they settled in. Finally, when the door was barred and a small fire crackled in the stove, Maria spoke. Why did you do it, James? Her dark eyes searched his face. Why risk everything? Keisha raised her head, the same question written in her expression. The marshal could have killed you. Still might. James took his time answering, warming his hands by the stove. The lamplight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines etched deep around his eyes. Because your lives matter, he said simply. To God, to me, to the future of this territory. He looked at each woman in turn. What Drennan's doing, it ain't justice. It's tyranny dressed up in a badge. Sometimes a man has to stand against wrong even if it costs him everything. Maria's eyes glistened in the lamplight. But claiming us both as wives? The town will never accept it. Maybe not, James agreed, but it bought us time. And sometimes that's all folks need to see the truth of things. Keisha moved closer to the stove, her usual timidity giving way to something stronger. When my husband... She swallowed hard. When he hurt me, nobody stood up. Nobody said my life mattered. James's heart ached at the pain in her voice. It matters now, you both do. The declaration hung in the air, simple but profound. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the hills, and somewhere in town, a piano tinkled from the saloon. But in that borrowed shack, something new was taking root. A family forged not by blood or law, but by choice and courage. Maria crossed to the window, peering out at the darkened street. Drennan won't let this rest. He'll find another way to come after us. Let him try, James said quietly. We're stronger together than apart. The three of them stayed close to the warmth of the stove as night settled over Silver Bluff. None of them knew what the morning would bring, but for now, they had shelter, they had each other, and they had hope. In the flicker of lamplight, James watched Maria and Keisha sharing a worn blanket, and knew that whatever came next, he'd made the right choice. No law written by men could outweigh the duty to protect those in need. As the fire burned low and the women dozed, James kept watch, his rifle close at hand. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, ancient and constant, while below, the small seeds of change had been planted in the heart of Silver Bluff. Dawn crept over Silver Bluff with a hesitant glow, as if the sun itself was wary of what the new day might bring. James woke first, his back stiff from sleeping upright in the wooden chair. The familiar weight of his rifle lay across his knees. Through the small window, he watched the town slowly come to life. Maria and Keisha still slept, huddled close on the narrow bed they'd shared. In the pale morning light, James could see the worry lines etched on their faces even in sleep. His declaration yesterday had bought them time, but morning brought fresh challenges. A soft knock at the door made both women stir. James rose quietly, moving to answer it with his rifle ready, but hidden behind the door. "Morning, McGraw," old Joe Cooper's wife Sarah whispered, holding out a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Brought you folks some fresh bread, still warm from the oven." She glanced past him, concern written on her weathered face. "Town's already talking something fierce." "Much obliged, Sarah," James said softly, accepting the bread. The warm, yeasty smell filled the small space. "Railroad men were at the saloon late last night," she continued, lowering her voice further. "Talking with Marshal Drennan. Whatever's brewing, it ain't good." Before James could respond, another figure appeared behind Sarah, Mrs. Henderson from the general store, clutching a basket of her own. "Brought some eggs and preserves," she announced, loud enough to wake the women inside. "Thought your wives might be hungry." The pause before wives carried volumes of unspoken questions. Soon a small parade of townswomen arrived, each bearing food and thinly veiled curiosity. Their whispered conversations carried through the thin walls as they clustered near the door. "Did you hear about the Apache raids? That Maria woman, her husband was Army, they say. And the other one, running from up north, Marshall says they're both trouble. But James McGraw's always been honest." Maria rose from the bed, her movements deliberate and dignified despite the gossip outside. She smoothed her long black hair and straightened her shawl. "We cannot hide here forever," she said quietly to James. "We must face them." Keisha sat up, pulling her worn shawl tight around her shoulders. "What if the marshal comes back?" James set his rifle aside and began laying out the offerings on the small table. "First thing's to see the preacher. Get this union properly blessed." He met their eyes in turn. "If you're willing." The women shared a long look. Finally, Maria nodded. Better to face it in daylight than skulk in shadows. They broke their fast with the townspeople's gifts, the fresh bread and preserves, a welcome change from trail rations. Outside, the morning bustle grew louder as Silver Bluff came fully awake. The walk to the church felt endless. James led the way, with Maria and Keisha following close behind. Townsfolk stopped to stare, conversations dying as they passed. Children pointed until their mothers hushed them. Even the usually boisterous saloon fell quiet as they walked by. The little white church sat on the edge of town, its spire reaching hopefully toward heaven. Reverend Thomas stood in the doorway, his kind face troubled as he watched them approach. "James," he greeted softly, "I heard about yesterday's events." "Reverend," James removed his hat, "we've come seeking a blessing." The preacher's eyes moved from James to the women, his expression torn. "Come inside. This isn't a conversation for the street." The church interior was cool and dim, smelling of old wood and beeswax. Their boots echoed on the plank floor as they followed Reverend Thomas to the front pew. "What you're asking," the preacher began carefully, "it's not just unusual. It could be seen as making mockery of sacred bonds." "There's no mockery intended," James said firmly. "These women need protection. The law is being twisted against them." "The law of man, perhaps." Reverend Thomas clasped his hands together. "But God's law speaks of mercy and justice," Maria interrupted, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet church. "My husband died serving this territory. Is there no mercy for his widow?" Keisha spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "When my husband beat me, the church in my town said I must endure it, that it was God's will." She raised her eyes to meet the preacher's. Was that truly his law? Reverend Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "No, child. That was man's cruelty, not God's will." He sighed heavily. "But this union you propose, it's built on fear, not love. How can I bless such a thing?" Before James could answer, the church door banged open. Marshal Drennan strode in, boots striking the floor like hammer blows. Railroad Agent Leland followed, a rolled document tucked under his arm. "Careful what you bless, Reverend," Drennan called out. "These women won't be around long enough for it to matter." James stood, positioning himself between the marshal and the women. "This is a house of God, Marshal." "And this," Drennan sneered as Leland unfurled the document, "is a treaty map. Shows clear as day that their precious homestead sits on land promised to the Apache." His thin smile grew cruel. "Course, they've graciously agreed to sell those rights to the railroad, ain't that right, Mr. Leland?" The railroad agent stepped forward, all polished manners and sharp eyes. "Indeed. The company has acquired all legal claims to the water rights in question. I'm afraid these ladies have no standing." Maria rose slowly, her face tight with anger. "My husband died defending this territory. He believed in promises made. Now you say those promises mean nothing?" "Your husband's service was admirable," Leland said smoothly. "But progress cannot be stopped. The railroad needs that water for the new line. And we need it to live," Keisha said, her voice stronger than before. "Our crops, our animals." "Should have thought of that before you took up with a murderer," Drennan spat. James's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice level. "Those accusations were never proven. Don't need to be now." The marshal tapped the treaty map. "This here's all the proof we need. You've tied yourself to a losing cause, McGraw. Last chance to walk away clean." Reverend Thomas cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should all pray on this matter. Seek guidance." "Save your prayers," Drennan cut in. "The law's clear, and it's only a matter of time before these women face justice." He turned on his heel, Leland following with a last calculating look at the group. The church fell silent, save for the echo of their departing footsteps. James felt the weight of the women's fears pressing down like a physical thing. "I'm sorry," Reverend Thomas said quietly, "but I cannot in good conscience bless this union. Not with such darkness hanging over it." They left the church as the morning sun climbed higher, its heat doing nothing to warm the chill that had settled in their hearts. The walk back to the borrowed shack seemed twice as long, every stare from the townsfolk now carrying new weight. Inside their temporary shelter, Keisha sank onto the bed, trembling. "Have we doomed ourselves? This ruse." "It's not a ruse," James said firmly. "It's a promise. We'll face this together." Maria stood by the window watching the street. The marshal will not wait long. And now the railroad. She trailed off, her shoulders tense. The day passed slowly, each hour marked by more curious visitors bringing food and questions in equal measure. As evening drew near, James lit the lamp while Maria laid out their simple supper on the rough table. The bread, for morning, had gone stale, but no one complained as they broke it between them. When the meal was done, James pulled a small Bible from his coat pocket. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling. He opened it carefully, the pages falling naturally to a familiar passage. "The Lord is my shepherd," he began reading, his deep voice filling the small space. "I shall not want." The words of the 23rd Psalm flowed like cool water, soothing their troubled spirits. Even Keisha's trembling eased as the ancient promises washed over them. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Maria's eyes grew distant, perhaps remembering other nights when these same words had brought comfort. Keisha's hands slowly unclenched in her lap. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." James closed the Bible gently. Outside, night had fallen fully over Silver Bluff. For the first time since their arrival, both women prepared for sleep without fear of immediate danger. The bed was narrow, but they managed to share it while James once again took his place in the chair by the door. As the lamp burned low, casting soft shadows on the walls, an uneasy peace settled over the shack. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now they had this moment of quiet. The sound of their breathing mingled with the distant coyote songs and the occasional piano notes drifting from the saloon. Sleep came slowly, but it came. And if their dreams were troubled by visions of treaty maps and railroad tracks, at least they faced those fears together under one roof, protected by the steady presence of a man who had chosen to stand against injustice, whatever the cost. Dawn crept over Silver Bluff with a biting chill that made James pull his coat tighter. Frost sparkled on the rough wooden steps of their borrowed shack. His breath misted in the early morning air as he waited for Maria and Keisha to finish preparing for their trip to the market square. "Best we go early," he said as the women emerged, "fewer folks to deal with." Keisha wrapped her threadbare shawl closer, her eyes darting nervously. Maria stood straight-backed beside her, dark eyes alert but calm. Together, they made their way down the dusty street toward the market square, their footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. The square was just coming to life, merchants setting up their stalls in the pale morning light. James led the women to the general store first, determined to show the town they had nothing to hide. The bell above the door jangled as they entered. "Morning," James said to the shopkeeper, who merely grunted in response. As they moved through the narrow aisles, whispers followed like shadows. "Bigamist," came a hiss from behind a stack of flour sacks. "Apache lover," muttered another voice. Keisha's hands trembled as she reached for a bolt of cloth. Maria quietly placed her hand over Keisha's, steadying her. "Focus on what we need," she murmured. "The rest is just wind." James watched the interaction, his heart heavy with both pride and concern. They gathered their supplies: flour, coffee, salt, a new pot to replace their cracked one. Each item carefully chosen, each purchase made openly and honestly. The morning wore on, the square filling with more townspeople. The whispers grew, but so did curious glances. Some folks nodded cautiously to James, having known him from his guide work before. Others turned away completely. A commotion near the water trough drew their attention. A young boy, no more than 8 years old, had stumbled and fallen. His mother rushed to help him up, but he swayed on his feet, face flushed with fever. Without hesitation, Maria moved toward them. The boy's mother pulled him back instinctively, but Maria held up her empty hands. "Your son is sick," she said quietly. "I can help." The woman hesitated, looking from Maria to her son, who shivered despite the strengthening sun. "How?" "I know the old ways," Maria explained. "Willow bark for the fever. Sage to ease his breathing." She reached slowly into her basket, drawing out small bundles of dried herbs she always carried. The mother's eyes darted around the square where several people had stopped to watch. "I don't know." "Look at him," Maria said gently. "Feel his forehead. The fever is climbing." The boy coughed, a wet rattling sound that seemed to decide his mother. She nodded once, sharply. Maria knelt beside the child, her movements sure and careful. She pressed dried willow bark into the mother's hand. "Brew this into tea 3 times today, and this," she held up the sage, "burn it in his room tonight. The smoke will help clear his chest." "Witch's work," someone muttered from the gathering crowd. James stepped forward, his presence a quiet warning. The whispers subsided, but the tension remained thick in the morning air. The boy's mother clutched the herbs, uncertainty warring with desperation on her face. "Thank you," she whispered finally, hurrying away with her son. By afternoon, word spread through the town like wildfire. The boy's fever had broken, his breathing eased. More whispers followed, but these held a different tone. "The Mexican woman knows healing," they said. "Her medicines work." As the sun began to set, a tentative knock came at their door. James opened it to find a young girl holding a covered dish. "Ma sent this," she said quickly, thrusting the food forward before darting away. More followed. A loaf of fresh bread left on the step. A jar of preserved peaches passed through a crack in the door. Small offerings of gratitude, delivered in secret as darkness fell. Inside their shack, James lit the lamp while Maria laid out their supper. The stew from their neighbors filled the small space with a rich aroma that made their mouths water after days of dry bread and beans. "This is real proper cooking," Keisha said softly, stirring her bowl. A small laugh escaped her, surprising them all. It was a gentle sound, like water over stones, and James realized it was the first time he'd heard her laugh since they'd met. Maria smiled, the lamplight softening her features. Food always tastes better when shared. "What you did today," James said, looking at Maria. "That took real courage." She shrugged, but her eyes were serious. "Healing is survival. My mother taught me that. When people are sick or hurting, they remember who helped them and who turned away." "Some still call it witchcraft," Keisha worried, her brief moment of joy fading. "Let them," Maria replied firmly. "Truth speaks louder than fear given time." James nodded, but movement outside the window caught his eye. 2 men stood in the shadows of the alley across the way, their shapes barely visible in the gathering dark. One held a notebook, scribbling by the light of a shuttered lantern. Railroad men by their city clothes and watching eyes. He said nothing to alarm the women, but his hand stayed close to his rifle as they finished their meal. The stew was indeed good, made better by the knowledge that not everyone in town wished them ill. Still, the presence of the railroad men troubled him. Their interest in Maria's healing abilities could mean nothing good. Later, as Keisha and Maria prepared for sleep, James checked the door's simple lock again. Outside, a cold wind had picked up, rattling the loose boards of their shack. The railroad men had vanished into the night, but their presence lingered like frost on glass. He settled into his chair by the door, rifle across his knees. In the small bed, the women's breathing gradually steadied into sleep. The lamp burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. James watched through the window as stars appeared in the clear, cold sky, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The day had brought both hope and danger. Maria's gift for healing had won them some goodwill, but it had also drawn unwanted attention. The railroad's eyes were on them now, adding another layer of threat to their already precarious situation. Through the thin walls came the sound of horses' hooves on the frozen ground, then silence. James remained vigilant, knowing that in Silver Bluff, even the night held secrets that could either save or destroy them. Dawn painted the sky in streaks of pale gold as James hitched the horses to their wagon. The morning air bit cold and sharp, making the animals' breath steam in white clouds. Maria and Keisha emerged from the shack wrapped in their warmest shawls, carrying bundles of food and water for the journey. "It's a fair piece to the valley," James warned, helping Keisha onto the wagon seat. "Might take us most of the morning to get there." Maria climbed up beside Keisha, her movements sure and practiced. "We need to see it with our own eyes," she said firmly. "If the railroad truly means to take our water rights, we should know what we're fighting for." James nodded, checking the harness one final time before mounting his horse. The street was quiet as they set out, only a few early risers watching their departure from behind curtained windows. Their small convoy, James on horseback leading the way, the wagon creaking behind, headed east toward the rising sun. The path grew rougher as they left town, wagon wheels catching and jolting on frozen ruts. James kept a steady pace, but progress was slow. The horses snorted and strained against the rocky trail, their hooves striking sparks from loose stones. "Whoa there," James called softly, guiding his mount around a particularly treacherous bend. The wagon followed carefully, Maria handling the reins with quiet confidence while Keisha gripped the seat beside her. As the sun climbed higher, the landscape opened before them, rolling hills giving way to scattered pine and juniper, the mountains a purple shadow on the horizon. James watched the women's faces as they traveled, noting Maria's determined set to her jaw and Keisha's nervous glances at every sound from the brush. Near midday, they crested a rise overlooking the disputed valley. James raised his hand, signaling a halt. The wagon creaked to a stop beside him. "There it is," Maria breathed, her voice tight with emotion. "My husband's land. Our water." The valley spread below them like a green jewel set in the rough brown earth. A clear stream wound through its heart, fed by springs that had never run dry in living memory. Ancient cottonwoods lined the watercourse, their leaves shimmering silver in the breeze. But something was wrong. Strange marks blazed on trees near the water, bright orange surveyor's paint that seemed to mock the natural beauty. And there, by the main spring, "Railroad men," James said grimly, pointing to where 3 figures moved through the trees, hammering stakes into the ground. Maria's hands tightened on the reins until her knuckles showed white. Keisha shrank back against the wagon seat, but Maria straightened her spine. "We're going down there," she declared. James nodded, already turning his horse toward the trail. "Stay behind me." They made their way down the slope, the wagon swaying on the uneven ground. As they approached, the surveyors looked up from their work. One man quickly tucked something into his vest. Papers, maybe maps. "This is private land," James called out, his voice carrying across the clear air. He reined in his horse, positioning himself between the wagon and the strangers. The oldest surveyor, a weathered man with brass instruments hanging from his belt, stepped forward. "We've got permission from Marshal Drennan himself. Railroads claiming right-of-way through this valley." "Permission?" Maria's voice cracked like a whip. She handed the reins to Keisha and jumped down from the wagon, striding forward. "This water was promised to my husband's family by the Apache elders themselves. The treaties protect it." "Ma'am," the surveyor said, not unkindly, "we're just doing our job. Take it up with the marshal if you've got complaints." Maria's anger seemed to radiate from her like heat waves. "My husband died serving in the army," she said, each word precise and sharp. "He believed in those promises." The elders swore this water would stay with his blood. James dismounted, moving to stand beside her. He could feel the tension building like a thunderhead. Keisha remained in the wagon, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. The sight of her distress made James's jaw clench. She had seen enough conflict in her life. They all had. "We're leaving," he announced firmly, "but this isn't settled." "Not by a long shot." The surveyor shrugged. "Suit yourself, but the railroad's coming through one way or another." They turned back, Maria rigid with suppressed fury as she climbed onto the wagon. The return journey seemed twice as long, the sun setting behind them as they finally reached Silver Bluff. By the time they pulled up to their shack, all three were exhausted from the travel and the confrontation. Inside, James lit the lamp while Maria unpacked their meager supper: bread, dried meat, the last of their morning coffee. Keisha moved quietly around them, setting out tin plates with trembling hands. "Here," James said softly, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his coat. He smoothed it on the rough table and began sketching with a stub of pencil. The valley took shape under his careful strokes. The stream, the springs, the stands of cottonwood. "This is what we're protecting," he said, marking the spots where the surveyors had placed their stakes. "This water's worth fighting for." Maria leaned over his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck as she studied the drawing. "The main spring," she murmured, touching the paper. "That's where the elders would meet, where they made their promises." Keisha watched them from her place by the stove, twisting her apron in her hands. "I never had nothing worth fighting for before," she whispered. "Just tried to stay alive, mostly." She paused, color rising in her pale cheeks. "But here, with you both, I feel safer than I ever did with him. Even if it ain't proper marriage." James looked up sharply, but Keisha continued, her voice growing stronger. "He was my lawful husband, sure enough, but he never once made me feel protected like this." Maria turned from the map, her earlier anger softening as she regarded Keisha. Something passed between the women, an understanding perhaps, or a shared pain. After a moment, Maria crossed to Keisha and gently took the twisted apron from her hands. "Come," she said, "help me with the coffee." James watched them work together in the lamplight, their movements becoming more natural with each passing day. The map lay before him, a reminder of all they stood to lose. But looking at his unlikely family, he wondered if perhaps they had already gained something far more precious. The night settled around their small shack, bringing with it the familiar sounds of the town winding down. James carefully folded the map and tucked it away. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now they had this moment of peace, three lost souls finding shelter in each other's company. Dawn barely touched the window pane when the pounding began. Heavy fists hammered the shack's thin door, making the whole structure shudder. James was already on his feet, one hand reaching for his rifle before Maria's quiet voice stopped him. "No weapons," she whispered. "It will only make things worse." The door burst open before James could respond. Two deputies filled the doorway, their badges catching the pale morning light. Behind them, more shapes moved in the gray dawn. "James McGraw," the taller deputy announced, his hand resting on his holster. "You're wanted for questioning about yesterday's interference with railroad business." Keisha pressed herself against the far wall, her eyes wide with fear. Maria stood very still by the cold stove, her face a mask of careful neutrality. "I'm coming," James said, his voice steady despite the sleep still rough in his throat. He reached for his coat, but the shorter deputy grabbed his arm. "No time for that. Marshal wants you now." They dragged James into the street, their grip bruising on his arms. The few early risers turned away, hurrying about their business as if they hadn't seen. Only old Mrs. Peterson, sweeping her porch across the way, paused to watch with worried eyes. "I can walk on my own," James said quietly, but the deputies ignored him, marching him down the dusty street toward the jail. Inside the shack, Keisha's legs gave out. She slid down the wall, wrapping her arms around herself as she shook. Maria knelt beside her, pressing a tin cup of water into her trembling hands. "Drink," Maria ordered gently. "We must stay strong." What will they do to him?" Keisha's voice quavered. Maria's eyes darkened. "Nothing permanent, not yet. The marshal needs the law on his side first." The morning stretched endless and silent. Maria kept her hands busy, sweeping the already clean floor, reorganizing their few supplies, anything to keep from staring at the door. Keisha remained huddled by the wall, jumping at every sound from the street. A soft knock startled them both. Maria approached the door cautiously, relaxing slightly when she recognized the preacher's voice calling through the wood. "Mrs. McGraw? Mrs. Santiago, may I come in?" Maria opened the door, noting how the preacher's eyes darted around the street before he stepped inside. His lined face was grave as he removed his hat. "I've come to warn you both," he said without preamble. "The marshal is building a case. He means to make an example of James, and of you two as well, if he can." Keisha made a small, frightened sound. The preacher's expression softened as he looked at her. "Don't despair," he said. "I've spoken to several townsfolk who will vouch for James's character. Good people here. They remember how he guided their wagon trains safely through the mountains, how he's always dealt fair with everyone regardless of their background." "Will it be enough?" Maria asked. The preacher twisted his hat in his hands. "I'll speak for him myself. But you must be very careful. The marshal has powerful friends, and the railroad's money speaks louder than justice these days." After the preacher left, the silence felt heavier than before. Maria paced the small space while Keisha watched from her corner, twisting her apron into knots. As the afternoon sun slanted through the window, Maria suddenly stopped. She turned to Keisha with determination in her eyes. "We should pray," she said. Keisha looked startled. I haven't, not since I was little. Pa used to make us pray before supper, but after he died." She trailed off, pain flickering across her face. "Then it's time to remember how," Maria said firmly. She knelt beside the cold stove, gesturing for Keisha to join her. "God hears all voices, even those rusty with disuse." Hesitantly, Keisha knelt beside her. Her hands shook as she clasped them together, childhood memories washing over her. The smell of her mother's bread, her father's deep voice reading scripture, the comfort of familiar words. "Dear Lord," Maria began, then fell silent, waiting. Keisha swallowed hard. "Dear Lord," she whispered, please keep James safe. He's a good man. He protected us when nobody else would." Her voice grew stronger. "Please don't let them hurt him. Please watch over all three of us, even though we're different from other families. Even though some folks say we're living in sin." Tears slid down her cheeks. "We need your protection, Lord. We ain't got nobody else." Maria's hand found hers, squeezing gently. They remained kneeling together as the afternoon light faded, their prayers mixing with the sounds of the town beyond their walls. The door opened just as dusk was settling. James stood in the doorway, one eye swollen and his shirt torn at the collar. But he was walking on his own, and his eyes were clear as he looked at them. "James!" Keisha started forward, then caught herself uncertain. Maria had no such hesitation. She went to him, examining his injuries with careful fingers. "Inside," she ordered. "Sit down before you fall down." He allowed them to guide him to a chair. Keisha hurried to pour water while Maria gathered her healing supplies. James watched them move around him, something soft and wondering in his expression despite the bruises. "The marshal?" Maria asked as she dabbed at a cut above his eye. "Released me with a warning," James said. "Seems several folks spoke up for me. The preacher, Mrs. Peterson, even old Tom from the livery stable. Said they'd known me for years as an honest man." He winced as Maria's cloth found a tender spot. "Marshall didn't like it, but he couldn't hold me without charges. Said next time would be different, though. Said he'd find a way to make something stick." Keisha set a plate of beans and cornbread before him, her movements hesitant. "You should eat something," she murmured. James caught her hand before she could retreat. He reached for Maria with his other hand, holding them both as he had that first day in the street. "I meant what I said then," he told them quietly. "Your lives matter. I won't abandon either of you, no matter what the marshal threatens." Maria's fingers tightened on his. Keisha's eyes filled with tears again, but she didn't pull away. They sat together long into the night, the fire crackling low in the stove. None of them wanted to be the first to move, to break this moment of connection. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the dark valley. Inside, 3 people who had been strangers days ago drew closer, bound together by shared danger and growing trust. James's hand remained steady on theirs, his touch a promise stronger than words. Maria's spine was straight with pride and determination, her presence a foundation they could build upon. And Keisha, who had spent so long shrinking from the world, found herself sitting taller, drawing strength from their unity. The fire popped and settled, sending shadows dancing across the walls of their humble shelter. Fear still lingered in the corners, but it seemed less overwhelming now, faced together. Prayer and protection, threat and deliverance had woven another strand into the rope binding them. Not husband and wives in truth, perhaps, but something just as sacred, a family chosen in adversity, forged in trust and care. They sat silent in the firelight, each lost in their own thoughts but anchored by the warmth of joined hands and shared purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they had this. 3 souls finding harbor in each other's company, their unlikely bond growing stronger with each trial faced together. Dawn painted the sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold as James McGraw stepped out of the small shack, breathing in the crisp morning air. His muscles still ached from yesterday's rough handling at the jail, but his spirit remained unbroken. Structure and routine would help them all, he decided. Keep their minds focused on living rather than fear. He heard movement inside as Maria and Keisha stirred. The borrowed shack wasn't much, 2 rooms with a lean-to kitchen, but it provided shelter. A scraggly garden plot held a few stubborn vegetables, and in a makeshift pen, a rangy goat bleated for attention. James opened the door, the hinges creaking softly. "Time to learn some chores," he announced. "Can't let worry keep us idle." Keisha looked up from where she was kindling the stove fire, her eyes uncertain. Maria paused in combing her long, dark hair, watching them both with quiet interest. "First task," James said, holding up the empty milk pail, "is seeing to that noisy goat." Keisha followed him outside, wringing her apron nervously. I don't know how." "Neither did I, first time," James assured her. "But goats are forgiving teachers most days." He demonstrated the proper position on the rough wooden stool, showing her how to grip gently but firmly. The goat shifted restlessly, making Keisha jump. "She doesn't like me," she whispered. "She doesn't know you yet," James corrected. "Here, like this." He guided her hands, showing her the rhythm. Steady and gentle, just like that. A thin stream of milk pinged against the pail. Keisha's face lit up with surprise and delight. Meanwhile, Maria had taken up the axe, studying the woodpile with a critical eye. The blade sang through the morning air as she swung, each stroke precise and practiced. The sound of splitting wood punctuated Keisha's tentative efforts with the goat. "There now, you're getting it," James encouraged as Keisha found her confidence. The goat had other ideas. With a sudden sidestep, she knocked the pail over, sending fresh milk splashing across Keisha's skirts. She let out a startled yelp. Maria paused in her wood splitting to look over, her eyes crinkled with amusement. "I see Vieja is living up to her name," she called. "That old goat has trained more novices than any schoolmarm." Keisha stared down at her milk-soaked apron and then, to James's surprise and pleasure, she began to laugh. It was a small sound at first, rusty from disuse, but it grew stronger. Maria joined in, her own laughter warm and rich. "Lord help me," Keisha gasped, wiping her eyes. "I must look a sight." "You look like a proper ranch woman now," Maria declared, setting down her axe. "Baptized by goat's milk. It's a rite of passage out here." James watched the women share this moment of mirth, his heart lightening. Laughter was a powerful medicine, one they sorely needed. The morning passed in steady work. Keisha tried again with the goat, more successfully this time. Maria's woodpile grew impressive, her movements sure and strong. James tended to the garden, pulling weeds and checking the vegetables while keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. As the sun climbed toward noon, they heard careful footsteps approaching. James straightened, hand moving instinctively toward his belt. but it was Sarah Peterson from the church who appeared around the corner, followed by several other women bearing bundles. "We came the back way," Sarah explained in a low voice. "I didn't want to draw attention." She looked at Maria and Keisha with kind eyes. "The ladies of the church, we've brought some things. Not charity, mind you, just neighborly gifts." The women spread their offerings on the rough table. Warm quilts pieced from scraps, fresh baked bread still carrying the scent of hearth fires, preserves in carefully labeled jars, and there, wrapped reverently in clean cloth, a well-worn family Bible. "My Joshua's mother's Bible," Sarah explained, pressing it into Keisha's hands. She'd want it to go to a family in need of comfort. Keisha's fingers trembled as she touched the leather binding. "We can't, it's too precious." "You can and you will," Sarah said firmly. "God's word belongs where it's needed and wanted." She squeezed Keisha's hand. "We're praying for you all, even if we can't show it openly yet." Maria stood straight and proud. "Thank you," she said simply, but her voice carried depths of meaning. The church women departed as quietly as they'd come, leaving behind more than just physical gifts. Their visit had built a bridge, showing that not all the town stood against them. The afternoon passed in domestic tasks. Maria taught Keisha how to preserve the extra milk, while James repaired loose boards in the floor. The shack slowly began to feel more like a home, despite its temporary nature. As evening approached, James lit the lamp while Maria and Keisha prepared a simple supper. The fresh bread from the church women made their usual beans feel like a feast. After they'd eaten, James picked up the gifted Bible, its pages soft with years of use. "Shall we?" he asked quietly. They gathered close as he opened to Proverbs, the lamplight warm on the well-loved pages. His deep voice filled the small space. "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding." The familiar words seemed to settle around them like a blanket, easing the day's tensions. Keisha leaned forward, drinking in each verse as if parched. Maria's eyes grew distant, perhaps remembering her own mother's prayers in Spanish. "In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths," James read on, his voice steady and sure. The lamp flickered, casting their shadows on the walls as the night deepened outside. None of them saw the dark figures that crept up to the shack in the deepest part of night. None heard the scratch of knife on wood as crude letters took shape on the door. The railway enforcers worked quickly and silently, their message brief but brutal: sell or burn. James found it at first light when he stepped out to begin the day's chores. His hands clenched as he read the ugly threat, carved deep into the wood. Without a word, he fetched his knife and began carefully scraping away the letters, erasing them before the women could see. His jaw tightened with each stroke of the blade. The threat itself didn't surprise him. He'd expected something like this. But the cowardly manner of it, sneaking in by night to frighten women, that fired his blood with quiet fury. He was still working when Maria stepped out, taking in the scene with one quick glance. She touched his arm gently. "Let me help," she said, producing her own knife. James hesitated, then nodded. Together they erased the threat, though they couldn't completely remove the scars in the wood. Like so much else in their lives, the marks would remain, a reminder of what they faced. "Should we tell Keisha?" Maria asked softly when they finished. James considered, looking at the door. "Not yet," he decided. "She's just beginning to feel safe here. Let her have that peace a little longer." Maria nodded, understanding in her eyes. They both knew darker days were coming, but for now, they would protect what small joys they'd found. The laughter over spilled milk, the kindness of neighbors, the comfort of scripture shared in lamplight. Inside, they could hear Keisha humming as she started the morning fire. A simple sound, but one that spoke of hope growing in rocky soil. James and Maria shared a look of quiet determination. Whatever the railroad men planned, they would face it together. The morning sun had barely cleared the hills when the telegraph operator's boy came running down Silver Bluff's dusty main street, waving a yellow paper. His footsteps echoed against the wooden boardwalk as he hurried toward the marshal's office, stirring up the early quiet. Inside Dawson's general store, James McGraw was measuring flour into a cloth sack, trying to stretch their meager coins as far as possible. The store owner's wife, Martha Dawson, kept glancing nervously at the door while weighing his purchase. The commotion outside drew closer. Through the store's grimy window, James watched as a crowd began gathering around the marshal's office. Their voices carried through the thin walls. 2 weeks, someone called out. Railroad's moving in 2 weeks? James's hand stilled on the flour sack. Martha Dawson clutched her apron, avoiding his eyes. They're saying the whole valley, another voice added. Everything from Cottonwood Creek clear down to the Springlands. That included Maria's homestead. James's jaw tightened as he listened to the growing excitement outside. Some voices sounded pleased about the coming progress, while others held notes of worry about what such rapid change might bring. Marshal Drennan's voice cut through the babble. Now, folks, this here's official business. Railroads got their rights, and they aim to exercise them. Anyone standing in the way. He paused meaningfully. Well, that'd be mighty unwise. James didn't wait to hear more. He quickly tied off the flour sack, left the correct coins on the counter, and slipped out the store's back door. His long strides ate up the distance to their borrowed shack, mind racing with plans and possibilities. He found Maria in the yard hanging wet laundry while Keisha swept the small porch. Both women looked up at his hurried approach, reading trouble in his expression. Inside, he said quietly, we need to talk. Once the door was shut, James shared what he'd overheard. Maria's face grew still as stone as he explained about the telegram and the railroad's intentions. Keisha's hands twisted in her apron, but she stayed silent, waiting. 2 weeks, Maria finally said, her voice flat. They think they can simply take what was promised to my husband's people? What he died defending? The marshal's backing them fully, James warned. They'll have armed men, legal papers. Papers. Maria spat the word. I have papers too. Treaties signed in good faith, witnesses to my husband's service. Will they honor those? James met her fierce gaze steadily. We could leave, he offered quietly. Find new land. Start fresh somewhere else. There's still open country further west. No. Maria's response came swift and certain. She crossed to the shelf where she kept her most precious possessions, her husband's military discharge papers, their marriage certificate, the treaty documents. Her fingers traced the faded ink. Miguel died believing in promises. His grave is in that valley. I will not abandon it. Thunder rumbled in the distance, warning of an approaching storm. Keisha moved to light the lamp, though it was still afternoon, the darkening sky making it necessary. What can we do against the railroad? She asked softly. They have so much power. We have truth, Maria answered. And right. And each other. She looked at James. Unless you wish to step aside? No one would blame you. James shook his head. I made a promise to protect you both. I mean to keep it. The first fat drops of rain began drumming on the roof as Keisha stirred the stew pot hanging over the fire. The simple domestic actions seemed to calm her nerves. Then we should eat, she said practically. Hard choices are better faced on a full stomach. They gathered around the small table as the storm grew stronger outside. Maria had taught Keisha her recipe for bean stew, enriched with wild onions and the last of their salt pork. The warm food and familiar routine helped ease the tension, though worry still hung heavy in the air. Lightning flashed, illuminating their faces. In that brief, bright moment, James saw how much had changed since he'd first brought these two wounded souls to town. Keisha sat straighter now, fear no longer haunting her eyes. Maria's defensive anger had softened into something more purposeful. And he himself, James stirred his stew, considering. He'd been so long alone after his wife's death, wanting nothing but solitude. Now he couldn't imagine facing these troubles without Maria's fierce courage or Keisha's quiet strength beside him. I need to tell you something, he said, suddenly setting down his spoon. Both women looked at him expectantly as thunder crashed overhead. I'm afraid, he admitted, his voice rough with honesty. Not of dying, I've faced that often enough, but of failing you both. Of making the wrong choice and seeing you suffer for it. Keisha reached across the table and covered his work-roughened hand with her smaller one. The gesture would have been unthinkable just weeks ago, when she flinched from any man's touch. You haven't failed us, she said firmly. You've given me back my dignity. For the first time since my husband turned cruel, I don't feel like a burden to be endured." Her voice grew stronger. "I'm not afraid anymore either. At least not like before. Whatever comes, we face it together." Maria watched them both, something softening in her dark eyes. "Then we fight," she said quietly, "but with dignity. Not like frightened animals, but like people who know their worth." She reached out to join her hand with theirs. "My husband believed in justice. Perhaps this is how we honor his memory, by standing together for what's right." The rain lashed harder against the roof, but inside their small shelter, something powerful was taking shape. 3 lost souls, brought together by desperate circumstances, choosing to become a family in truth as well as name. "Together then," James agreed, his voice steady despite the storm. "Whatever comes." They finished their meal as the thunder rolled overhead, each lost in thought but drawing comfort from the other's presence. The lamp flickered, casting their shadows on the wall. 3 separate shapes merged into one. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the day's dust and cooling the summer-baked earth. Inside, 3 people who had started as strangers sat in peaceful silence, their choice made. They would hold their ground, come what may. The storm raged on, but they had found shelter in each other. It wasn't the family any of them had imagined, but it was real and true nonetheless. Whatever the railroad might bring, they would face it as one. The morning sun painted Silver Bluff in gentle gold, chasing away the last traces of yesterday's storm. James McGraw stood in the yard of their borrowed shack, checking the sights on his old Winchester rifle while dew still sparkled on the grass. Keisha emerged from the cabin, her hair neatly braided and her patched skirt brushing the wet grass. She carried 3 tin cups of steaming coffee, handing one to James with steady hands. Gone was the trembling woman who had first arrived in town. "Good morning," she said softly, settling on a rough-hewn bench. "Maria's finishing the cornmeal mush. She says we need our strength today." James nodded, sipping the strong coffee. "She's right, especially you, if you're willing to learn the rifle." Keisha's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't flinch. "You think I should?" "I think everyone in this family needs to know how to protect themselves," James answered carefully. "But only if you're ready." Maria appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "She's ready," she said firmly. "I've seen how steady her hands have become." She joined them on the bench, accepting the 3rd cup of coffee from Keisha. "Besides, I need to check my snare lines today. We can't depend on the general store forever." James studied both women, marveling at how naturally they had begun to work together. Maria's quiet strength seemed to flow into Keisha, while Keisha's gentle nature helped soften Maria's harder edges. After breakfast, they walked to a quiet spot behind the cabin, where James had set up some tin cans on a fallen log. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and pine from the hills. "First rule," James said, holding the rifle carefully, "is to treat every gun as if it's loaded. Always." He demonstrated proper handling, showing Keisha how to check the chamber and hold the weapon safely. Keisha listened intently, her face serious. When James handed her the rifle, she took it with reverence, copying his movements exactly. Maria watched from nearby while sorting her snare materials, offering encouraging nods. "That's it," James praised as Keisha properly shouldered the weapon. "Now, sight down the barrel. See that front sight? Line it up with the rear notch, just like threading a needle." A small smile touched Keisha's lips at the familiar comparison. She squared her shoulders, drew a steady breath, and squeezed the trigger just as James had shown her. The rifle cracked, and one of the tin cans jumped off the log. "I did it!" Keisha's face lit up with surprise and pride. "I actually hit it." "Well done," Maria called, grinning. "Now you can help keep the coyotes from our chickens when we get some." They spent the next hour practicing, Keisha's confidence growing with each shot. Her natural patience served her well, and soon more cans were hitting the ground than staying on the log. Maria headed out to check her snare lines, her knowledge of the local game trails proving invaluable. She returned mid-morning with 2 plump rabbits, holding them up triumphantly. "See?" she laughed. "Between Keisha's shooting and my snares, we'll eat well enough." Their laughter drifted down into the valley, carried on the morning breeze. For a moment, it seemed impossible that anything could shatter this peace they'd built. As the sun climbed higher, James suggested they visit neighbors to discuss the water rights situation. They needed allies if they hoped to stand against the railroad's plans. Their first stop was the widow Chen's small farm. The Chinese woman had lost her husband to a mining accident and struggled to maintain her vegetable gardens alone. She listened intently as Maria explained about the railroad's intentions. "They take your water, they take all water," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "I help. My husband say, always help neighbors." The Anderson family, whose sheep grazed the lower pastures, proved harder to convince. "The marshal's got authority," Mr. Anderson warned. "Going against him could cost us everything." "And what will you have left when the railroad owns all the water?" Maria countered. "How will your sheep survive?" By mid-afternoon, they had visited a dozen households. Some agreed to stand with them, while others closed their doors in fear. But even the reluctant ones listened, and that was something. The sun was setting when they finally returned home. James built up the fire while Keisha and Maria prepared a simple supper of rabbit stew and fresh cornbread. The familiar domestic routine felt especially precious now. 8 families, Maria said, breaking the cornbread into shares. 8 who promised to stand with us. Been 3 more thinking about it, Keisha added, stirring the stew. Mrs. Anderson was wavering, I could tell. She knows they need that water for their sheep. James nodded, watching the firelight play across their faces. It's a start. People are scared, but they're also starting to see the truth. The railroad won't stop with our land. They ate together in comfortable silence, sharing the warm cornbread and savory stew. Through the cabin's small window, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. The fire crackled softly, and for a precious moment everything felt right with the world. I never thought I'd find this again, Keisha said suddenly, her voice soft. A real home. People who... She paused, searching for words. Who see you, Maria finished for her. Who value you for yourself, not what they can take from you. James looked at both women, his heart full. That's what family should be. Outside the cabin's warm circle of light and hope, shadows gathered in the growing darkness. But inside, 3 people who had started as strangers sat together in peace, sharing bread and dreams of a future they would build together. The evening wrapped around them like a gentle blanket, holding their small family in its embrace. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had this moment of perfect contentment. Keisha poured more coffee, the familiar ritual a comfort. Maria hummed softly as she mended a torn shirt by the fire. James cleaned his rifle, the rhythmic movements peaceful rather than threatening. In the valley below, crickets began their evening song. A cool breeze carried the scent of sage through the open window, along with the promise of another fair day tomorrow. Unknown to the peaceful household, dark figures moved through the deepening dusk. Deputies gathered in the shadows of the marshal's office, checking weapons and receiving quiet orders. But inside the cabin, hope and love continued to burn bright, like the steady flame of their lamp against the gathering night. The 3 continued their evening tasks, each content in the knowledge that they were no longer alone. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together, their bond stronger than any legal document or marshal's threat. In the firelight, their shadows danced on the cabin walls, 3 separate shapes that had somehow grown into one family, united in purpose and love. The peace of the moment wrapped around them like a warm quilt, precious and pure. The first light of dawn had barely touched the eastern sky when heavy boots thundered across the cabin's porch. James woke instantly, years of mountain instincts alerting him to danger. Before he could shout a warning, the door splintered inward under the force of multiple shoulders. Deputies poured through the broken entrance, rifles raised. Their dark shapes filled the small room, blocking the pale morning light. The peaceful home they had created exploded into chaos. "Everyone up now!" A deputy's voice boomed through the cabin. Maria was already moving, placing herself between the intruders and Keisha, who had scrambled from her bedroll with a terrified cry. James lunged for his rifle, but 2 deputies tackled him before he could reach it. "Stop. We've done nothing wrong." James fought against the men trying to pin him down. His elbow caught one deputy in the jaw, sending the man sprawling. "That's assault on a lawman," another deputy snarled, swinging his rifle butt. The wooden stock crashed against James's temple, sending him to his knees. Stars exploded behind his eyes as rough hands yanked his arms behind his back. Keisha's scream pierced the morning air as two more deputies grabbed her arms. "Please, no! James! Maria!" "You're under arrest for bigamy and moral corruption," one of the men growled, dragging her toward the door. Her bare feet scraped across the wooden floor as she struggled. Maria launched herself at the men holding Keisha, her dark eyes blazing with protective fury. "Leave her alone!" She managed to rake her nails across one deputy's face before another struck her hard across the cheek with an open hand. The force of the blow sent Maria spinning to the floor. She tried to rise, but a boot pressed between her shoulder blades, pinning her down. "That's enough from you, half-breed," the deputy sneered. "Marshall's got special plans for your kind." James fought against the iron grip of handcuffs, his vision still blurry from the blow to his head. "Maria!" "Keisha." Blood trickled down his temple as he thrashed against the restraints. Another rifle butt slammed into his ribs, driving the air from his lungs. He doubled over, gasping, as the deputies dragged him toward the door. The morning air hit him like a slap as they hauled him outside. Neighbors stood in their doorways, watching in shocked silence as the peaceful family was torn apart. Mrs. Chen wrung her hands helplessly from her porch. The Anderson children peeked from behind their mother's skirts, eyes wide with fear. "Get these two to the jail," a deputy ordered, shoving James toward a waiting wagon. "The woman goes to the marshal's office for questioning." "No!" Keisha's voice cracked with terror as they separated her from the others. Her face had gone pale as milk, memories of past abuse clearly haunting her eyes. "Please don't take me there." James renewed his struggles despite the pain shooting through his head and ribs. "Leave her be. She's done nothing wrong." Another blow silenced him, and darkness swam at the edges of his vision. Maria had managed to push herself to her knees, blood trickling from her split lip. "Keisha, be strong. We will find you." Her words ended in a cry of pain as a deputy kicked her hard in the side. The morning sun climbed higher as they were divided. James was thrown into the back of the prison wagon like a sack of grain. Through swollen eyes, he watched helplessly as Keisha was marched toward the marshal's office, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Maria remained crumpled in the dirt of their yard, one arm wrapped protectively around her ribs. The deputies left her there, perhaps assuming she was too injured to cause trouble. They didn't know her strength. The wagon rattled through the town, drawing stares from early morning workers and shopkeepers. James tested his cuffs, finding them cruelly tight. His head throbbed where they'd struck him, and each breath sent daggers of pain through his side. At the jail, they dragged him into a narrow cell and chained him to the wall. The heavy iron door clanged shut with horrible finality. "Enjoy your stay," the deputy smirked. "Marshall will be by later to discuss your crimes." Left alone, James sank to his knees on the cold stone floor. Blood dripped steadily from his temple, staining his shirt collar. Every breath was agony, suggesting at least one broken rib. The morning crawled past like molasses in winter. Through his cell's tiny window, James watched the sun climb higher, marking each hour of separation from his family. Guilt and worry gnawed at his gut. What was happening to Keisha? Was Maria badly hurt? He thought of Keisha's terror as they dragged her away, remembered the marshal's cruel eyes whenever he looked at her. The memory made him sick with fear for her safety. By afternoon, James's injuries had stiffened into constant pain. The jail was quiet, except for the occasional shuffle of boots as deputies passed his cell. None would meet his eyes or answer his questions about Keisha and Maria. Through the window, he caught glimpses of Maria moving through town, one hand pressed to her injured side. Despite her obvious pain, she walked with determination, stopping to speak with various families. He recognized several faces from the local Apache community, saw the way they listened intently to her words. Pride mixed with worry in his chest. Maria was rallying support, but at what cost to her safety? The marshal wouldn't take kindly to such defiance. As evening approached, James's cell grew darker. No one had brought food or water, but he couldn't have eaten anyway. His throat was too tight with fear for his family. When night finally fell, James eased himself to his knees, ignoring the protest of his injuries. The stone floor was hard beneath him as he bowed his head in prayer. "Lord," he whispered, voice rough with pain and emotion, "I need your wisdom now more than ever." Show me how to protect them. Give me strength to endure whatever comes. Watch over Keisha and Maria. Shield them from harm. His prayers continued long into the night, a steady stream of desperate pleas for guidance and protection. Outside his cell window, moonlight painted silver streaks across the valley that had brought them together. That same moonlight fell across Maria as she finally limped home to their violated cabin. Her face was swollen, lips split, and painful. Each breath sent sharp pains through her bruised ribs, but her eyes burned with determination as she moved carefully through their ransacked home. She gathered medicines from her stores: willow bark for pain, yarrow for bruises, sage for cleansing. Her hands trembled slightly as she brewed the healing tea, but her movements were sure and practiced. As she sipped the bitter medicine, Maria's mind worked furiously. She had spent the afternoon speaking with Apache families who lived on the outskirts of town, explaining what had happened. Many remembered her husband's service as an army scout, how he had tried to bridge the gap between their peoples. They had listened gravely to her story, nodding as she described the railroad's greed and the marshal's corruption. Several of the older men had exchanged knowing looks, recalling other broken promises and stolen lands. "We will help," they had told her. "This valley was promised to your husband's line. We remember." Now alone in the cabin's darkness, Maria allowed herself a moment of grief. She touched the empty bedrolls where her family should be sleeping, felt again the terror in Keisha's scream as they dragged her away. But she couldn't afford to wallow in sorrow. James and Keisha needed her strong, needed her thinking clearly. She had survived worse than this. They all had. The valley stretched silent and dark beyond the cabin's broken door. Just days ago, it had echoed with their laughter as Keisha learned to shoot, and James told his gentle stories. Now that peace lay shattered like the splinters of their door. Maria straightened her shoulders, ignoring the stab of pain the movement caused. Tomorrow would bring its own battles. Tonight, she needed to rest and heal, gather her strength for what was to come. She settled carefully onto her bedroll, keeping one hand pressed to her aching side. Through the broken door, she could see the stars scattered across the night sky like diamonds on black velvet. Somewhere out there, James and Keisha were watching those same stars. "Be strong," she whispered into the darkness. "Hold on. We will find a way." The night wrapped around the valley like a thick blanket, hiding its secrets in shadow. In his cell, James continued his prayers. In the marshal's custody, Keisha huddled in fear. And in their broken home, Maria planned for tomorrow's fight. The moon sailed slowly overhead, casting its silver light over them all. 3 hearts connected by love and trust, now separated by the marshal's cruelty. But not forever. Never forever. Dawn crept through the jail's narrow window, painting pale stripes across James's bruised face. He hadn't slept, spending the night alternating between prayer and testing his chains for weakness. His ribs screamed with each movement and dried blood crusted his temple. A deputy shoved a tin plate through the cell door's slot. Stale bread and cloudy water sloshed onto the stone floor. James didn't move to take it, keeping his eyes fixed on the patch of sky visible through his window. The morning light reminded him of another dawn years ago, when he'd held his wife Sarah's hand as she slipped away. Fever had taken her quickly, leaving him alone with promises and regret. "I'll never love again, Sarah," he'd sworn at her grave. "My heart's buried here with you." Now chains binding him to the cold wall, James felt the weight of that promise. He'd meant it then, had lived it for years in his solitary life in the mountains. But Maria's quiet strength and Keisha's gentle spirit had awakened something he'd thought forever dead. "Lord," he whispered, voice rough from thirst, "I made that promise in grief. Was I wrong to open my heart again? To care for these women who needed protection?" His prayers echoed off stone walls, seeking answers. Across town, Maria moved carefully through the morning market. Her bruises had darkened overnight, drawing worried glances from townspeople. She kept her head high, though each step sent pain through her injured ribs. "Did you hear?" a woman whispered to her friend as Maria passed. "The marshal's keeping that poor Keisha locked up like an animal." "Ain't right," her companion muttered. "That girl never hurt nobody." Maria noted the sympathy in their voices, tucking it away like precious coins. She'd need every scrap of goodwill to help her family. The church bell tolled 9 o'clock as Maria climbed the wooden steps to the preacher's door. She knocked firmly, waiting in the cool morning air. Preacher Davidson opened the door himself, his kind face creasing with concern at her injuries. "Mrs. Santiago, please come in. I've been praying for you all." The preacher's study was modest but welcoming, sunlight streaming through clean windows. Maria settled carefully into a straight-backed chair, hiding her wince of pain. "Tell me true, preacher," she said, meeting his eyes. "What hold does the railroad have on our marshal?" Davidson sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "I've suspected for months. Railroad agent Horace Leland keeps visiting his office late at night. Papers changing hands, whispered conversations." "The marshal works for them," Maria stated flatly. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Davidson admitted. "They want the valley's water rights for their steam engines. The marshal's job is to clear out anyone with legitimate claims." He looked down at his worn Bible. "I should have spoken up sooner." "You can speak up now," Maria said quietly. "Your words carry weight in this town." The preacher nodded slowly. "I'll pray about it." "And Maria," he caught her hand as she rose to leave. "God hasn't abandoned you. Or James. Or Keisha." "I know," she answered. "He brought us together, didn't he?" She spent the rest of the morning visiting homes throughout town, speaking quietly with women who had shown kindness before. Many offered food, medicine, or simply prayers. A few promised to speak with their husbands about standing against the marshal's actions. By afternoon, Maria's side ached fiercely, but she pressed on. The Apache families she'd rallied yesterday had spread word to others. Small groups gathered at the edge of town, watching and waiting. Their presence made the deputies nervous. As dusk approached, Maria made her way to the jail. She carried a small basket of food, ostensibly bringing dinner to the deputies. They barely glanced at her as she set it on their desk. While they were distracted with fresh bread and meat, Maria slipped around the building's corner. James's cell window was just above head height. She pulled a folded note from her sleeve and waited for the right moment. When the deputy's laughter carried from inside, Maria quickly tossed the note through the bars. It landed with a soft flutter. Inside his cell, James started at the unexpected sound. He moved carefully to retrieve the paper, mindful of his chain's rattle. Maria's neat script filled the small page. "Hold fast. Friends gather. God hasn't forgotten us, and neither have good people. Keisha is alive. They keep her in the marshal's storeroom. I hear her prayers at night. Stay strong, my friend. Help is coming." James pressed the note to his chest, feeling its warmth like a lifeline. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered. "Thank you for not leaving us alone." Tears stung his eyes as he read the words again. Keisha was alive. Maria was fighting for them. And most importantly, God was still listening. Across town in the marshal's office, Keisha huddled in a corner of the locked storeroom. Dried goods and supplies surrounded her, but she'd barely touched the food they'd brought. Her throat was raw from crying, but still she whispered prayers into the gathering darkness. "Lord, give me courage like David had. Help me be strong like James and Maria showed me." She thought of James's gentle strength, how he'd claimed them both without hesitation. She remembered Maria's fierce protection, standing between her and the deputy's blows. "They gave me a family," she prayed. "Please don't let it end like this." The storeroom's single window let in a shaft of fading sunlight. Keisha reached out to touch it, remembering how just days ago she'd laughed while learning to milk the goat. How Maria had teased her kindly about spilled milk. How James had smiled, watching them become sisters in heart if not blood. New tears fell, but these weren't solely from fear. She cried for the love she'd found, the family that had chosen her. And underneath her grief, a tiny spark of hope flickered. "I'm not alone anymore," she whispered. "God sent them to me. He won't abandon us now." Night settled over the town like a heavy blanket. In his cell, James carefully refolded Maria's note and tucked it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. The weight of his promise to Sarah felt lighter now, transformed by new understanding. "You wouldn't want me to stop loving, would you, Sarah?" he murmured. "You had such a generous heart. You'd tell me to help them, to care for them. Peace filled him as he realized the truth. My heart didn't die with you. It just needed time to heal. He shifted position, easing the strain on his injured ribs. The chains clinked softly as he bowed his head in prayer. Lord, he prayed, thank you for showing me it's not betrayal to love again. Thank you for sending Maria and Keisha into my life. Give us strength for whatever comes next. And Lord, he smiled slightly, thank you for good people who still stand up for what's right. The night deepened. 3 separate souls bound by love and faith kept their vigils. James in his cell, finding renewed hope through prayer. Maria in their broken cabin, planning tomorrow's battles. Keisha in her makeshift prison, discovering courage she never knew she had. And above them all, stars scattered across the dark sky like diamonds spilled from God's own hand, bearing silent witness to their prayers. Dawn broke with heavy clouds and a chill wind that rattled windows throughout Silver Bluff. Maria was already awake, having spent most of the night in prayer, when she heard the first shouts from the street. Hanging? There's to be a hanging at sundown. Her heart stopped. Racing to the door, she caught the arm of a passing boy. What news? Marshall's posted notice, the boy said, eyes wide. Says that woman Keisha Turner's to hang for bigamy and harboring outlaws. Sundown today. Maria's legs nearly gave way. She steadied herself against the doorframe, mind racing. There wasn't much time. Sundown came early in autumn. She grabbed her shawl and her husband's old medicine pouch, moving with desperate purpose. The stable master's boy helped her saddle her horse without a word, his young face troubled. God be with you, Mrs. Santiago, he whispered as she mounted. The horse's hooves thundered against packed earth as Maria rode hard toward the Apache camps outside town. Wind whipped her hair, and prayer flowed from her lips in a steady stream, switching between Spanish and Apache as her heart demanded. Elder Nantan was already awake, sitting before his morning fire when she arrived. He looked up at her approach, his weathered face grave. The woman Keisha is to die, he stated before Maria could speak. Yes. Maria dismounted carefully, showing proper respect despite her urgency. Elder, I come to beg help. Not with violence, but with witness. The marshal claims this land was never promised to my husband's people, that the water rights were never guaranteed in treaty. The elder's eyes flickered. I remember the day of signing. I was young then, but I stood with my father as promises were made. Will you come? Maria asked. Will you bring others who remember? The marshal thinks he can erase our rights with one woman's death. Show him he cannot erase our memory. Nantan was silent for a long moment, smoke rising between them. Finally, he nodded. I will come, and others will come with me. Some young men also, to show our future has not forgotten either. Relief flooded Maria's chest. Thank you, Elder. We gather in town before sundown. Meanwhile, across town, deputies dragged James from his cell to the marshal's office. His chains rattled as they forced him into a chair before Marshal Drennan's desk. The marshal looked up from his paperwork with a cold smile. Well, if it ain't the false husband himself, come to beg for your pretend wife's life? James met his gaze steadily. There's nothing false about protecting those who need it. Protecting? Drennan barked a laugh. You've doomed that girl. If you'd left well enough alone, she might have slipped away quiet-like. Now she'll hang as an example. An example of what? James demanded. Your greed? Your willingness to murder an innocent woman for railroad money? The marshal's face darkened. He stood leaning across the desk. You think you're so righteous, don't you? Playing hero to a pair of worthless women, a half-breed witch and a runaway wife. Their dignity matters more than my life, James said quietly. God sees their worth, even if you're blind to it. Drennan struck him hard across the face. James tasted blood but didn't flinch. Take him back to his cell, the marshal spat. Let him listen to the crowds gather for his wife's hanging. The deputies roughly hauled James to his feet. As they dragged him toward the door, he turned back. I'll pray for your soul, Marshal. You'll need it. Through the morning hours, Maria worked tirelessly. She gathered herbs from her garden, grinding them with practiced hands into a calming medicine for Keisha. The familiar work helped steady her own trembling fingers. Lord, she whispered, give her strength. Let this ease her fear. She wrapped the medicine in clean cloth, then sought out the women who had shown kindness before. Sarah Miller, the baker's wife, agreed to take bread to the jail, with Maria's package hidden inside. Anna Johnston, who cleaned the marshal's office, promised to slip the medicine to Keisha. Storm clouds gathered overhead as Maria made her way to the church. She found the preacher in his study, head bowed over his Bible. "Will you speak?" she asked simply. Davidson looked up, his face drawn with conflict. "I've been wrestling with God all night, Mrs. Santiago." The marshal claims the law's on his side. "Is it God's law," Maria pressed, "to kill a woman for accepting protection? To steal land promised in treaty?" The preacher's hands tightened on his Bible. "No," he said finally. "No, it's not God's law at all." "Then speak. Your words carry weight. The town will listen." He nodded slowly. "I'll speak. Before the hanging, though I doubt the marshal will listen." "God will hear," Maria said firmly. "That's what matters." As afternoon crept toward evening, Maria returned home to prepare herself. She changed into her best dress, the one she'd worn to her husband's funeral. The irony wasn't lost on her. A knock at the door revealed Anna Johnston, face flushed with success. "I got the medicine to her," she whispered. "Poor thing's terrified, but she took it. Said to tell you she's trying to be brave." Maria squeezed the woman's hand in silent thanks. Through the window, she could see people beginning to gather in the town square. Among them stood several Apache elders, their presence drawing uncertain looks from the townsfolk. Elder Nantan had kept his word. Nearly 20 of their people had come, including several young men. They stood quietly, dignified, a living reminder of promises made and broken. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Maria made her final preparations. She tucked her medicine pouch into her pocket and pinned her shawl firmly against the rising wind. The storm matched her mood, dark, with promise of something powerful approaching. A commotion from the street drew her attention. Deputies were moving James from the jail to the square, likely wanting him to witness the execution. Despite his chains and bruises, he walked with his head high. Their eyes met briefly across the crowd. Maria saw the same steel in his gaze that she'd seen that first day, when he'd claimed both women as his wives. His words to the marshal rang in her mind. "Their dignity matters more than my life." More townspeople arrived as the sky darkened. Women who had brought food and blankets to their cabin, men who had defended James's character, children who had accepted Maria's healing touch without prejudice. They gathered in uncertain clusters, murmuring among themselves. Maria watched the preacher make his way through the crowd toward the hastily constructed gallows. His Bible was clutched tight in his hands, his face set with determination. She sent up another silent prayer of thanks for his courage. The wind picked up, carrying the first spatters of rain. Thunder growled closer, as if heaven itself protested what was about to happen. Maria touched her medicine pouch, drawing strength from the familiar worn leather. "The medicine will steady her heart," she whispered. "God steady all our hearts for what comes next." Through the crowd, she glimpsed the marshal emerging from his office, leading a shackled Keisha toward her fate. The young woman's face was pale but composed, the calming medicine doing its work. Even in her fear, she walked with dignity. Maria straightened her spine, ready to face whatever the storm might bring. The sun was already hidden behind thick clouds, but she knew sundown approached. Their time was running out. Thunder cracked overhead like God's own voice as the crowd drew closer to the gallows. Maria moved carefully through the press of people, positioning herself where Keisha would see her, where she could witness every moment of what was to come. The wind caught her shawl, whipping it like a battle flag. Around her, she heard whispered prayers mixing with the growing storm. Not all hearts in Silver Bluff were hardened. Not all souls had forgotten justice. Elder Nantan and his people stood like stones among the shifting crowd, their presence a silent accusation. The young Apache men's eyes burned with controlled anger, but they maintained their elder's dignity. The hour of sundown approached, hidden behind storm clouds black as judgment. Maria lifted her chin against the wind and rain, her heart pounding out a rhythm of desperate prayer. They would not face this moment alone. God saw them, the people saw them, and Maria Santiago, daughter of two proud peoples, would see justice done, one way or another. Dawn crept over Silver Bluff with a sullen glow. Heavy clouds hung low, pregnant with storms to come. The town stirred uneasily, like a beast waking to the scent of blood. Shopkeepers opened their doors slowly, casting worried glances toward the newly built gallows that cast its shadow across the square. The morning air felt thick, charged with more than just coming rain. Women gathered in doorways, speaking in hushed voices. Men clustered near the saloon, their faces grim. Children were kept indoors, though small faces pressed against window panes, sensing something terrible approached. Maria walked down the dusty street, her spine straight as a rifle barrel. At her side moved Elder Nantan, his weathered face calm beneath his gray hair. Behind them came other Apache elders and warriors, their presence drawing stares from the townsfolk. Their moccasins made no sound on the packed earth, but their dignity spoke volumes. "The treaty speaks true," Elder Nantan said quietly in his own tongue. "The water rights belong to our people, and to those who married into our families." Maria nodded, touching the medicine pouch at her waist. "The marshal thinks paper can wash away blood ties," she answered in the same language. "He forgets that some bonds run deeper than ink." They took their place near the gallows, forming a solid wall of witness. The Apache warriors stood with arms crossed, their dark eyes fixed on the marshal's office. Some townsfolk shifted uncomfortably at their presence. Others nodded with cautious respect, remembering Maria's healing touch on their sick children. A commotion drew attention to the jail. Deputies marched James McGraw into the square, chains rattling with each step. Despite his bruised face and shackled hands, he walked tall. His eyes found Maria's across the crowd, and something passed between them. Strength, perhaps, or prayer. The deputies forced James to stand near the gallows steps. He turned his face to the sky, lips moving in silent communion with his God. Maria felt her heart clench at the sight. This man had risked everything to protect two women, society deemed worthless. Now he would watch one die for that mercy. Thunder growled in the distance as more townspeople gathered. The preacher arrived, clutching his Bible like a shield. His face was pale, but determination showed in every line. He climbed partway up the gallows steps, turning to face the growing crowd. "Good people," he began, voice quavering slightly. "We gather here in the sight of God." "Save your breath, preacher." Marshal Drennan's voice cut through the square like a knife. He strode from his office, boots striking hard against the wooden sidewalk. "This isn't a wedding. It's justice." Behind him, two deputies led Keisha Turner toward the gallows. She wore a clean dress, her hair neatly combed. Though her face was pale as morning milk, she walked steady. Maria saw her lips moving slightly, and knew the calming medicine was helping her stay strong. "Stop this mockery," James shouted, straining against his chains. "She's innocent." The marshal backhanded him hard across the mouth. "Quiet, McGraw. You'll get your turn soon enough." He reached into his coat and pulled out a rolled document. "But first, let's remind everyone exactly who holds authority here." Erstar. With a flourish, he unfurled the treaty map. The yellowed paper crackled in the rising wind. This document, signed by territorial governors and Apache chiefs alike, gives the railroad full rights to develop these lands. Anyone interfering— He smiled coldly at Keisha. "Well, they face the consequences of defying progress." Thunder cracked closer, making some in the crowd jump. The air grew heavier, matching the tension that coiled through the square like a rattler ready to strike. "That treaty was signed under false pretenses," Elder Nantan's voice carried clearly. "The water rights were promised to our people, and to those who married into our families." He gestured to Maria. Her husband served the army faithfully. His blood bought those rights. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Many remembered Maria's husband, the Apache scout who died helping track raiders. They'd attended his funeral, offered condolences. Now they shifted uneasily, looking between the marshal's treaty and the dignified elders. "The law is the law," Drennan snapped, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He hadn't expected the Apache to come in force, to stand as witnesses. The preacher cleared his throat. "Marshal, perhaps we should dash." "Proceed with the execution," Drennan cut him off. He nodded to his deputies. "Get her up there." The deputies moved toward Keisha, but she stepped forward on her own. Her eyes found Maria's, then James's, drawing strength from both. As she climbed the gallows steps, her voice rose clear and steady in prayer. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The preacher's voice joined hers, then James's. The words spread through the crowd like ripples in still water. Even some of Drennan's deputies bowed their heads, caught by the power of the psalm. Maria watched Keisha reach the platform, saw her hands tremble slightly as they bound her wrists. The girl who had fled an abusive marriage, who had found protection under James's roof, who had begun to laugh again. She stood now before the hangman with more courage than her tormentors could comprehend. Thunder boomed directly overhead, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. They struck the treaty map in Drennan's hands, making the ink run slightly. He cursed and tried to roll it up, but the wind caught it, making the paper snap like a flag. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by forces they might not understand but could surely feel. The line between justice and murder, between law and greed, between fear and courage, it ran straight through this moment, straight through the way. Maria touched her medicine pouch, praying the herbs would keep Keisha's heart steady. James strained against his chains, every muscle rigid with the need to protect. The Apache warriors watched through narrowed eyes, hands empty but ready. Above them all, the storm gathered its strength. Like God's own fury building, black clouds boiled overhead. Another crack of thunder shook the windows of Silver Bluff, and the rain began to fall in earnest. The marshal stood at the foot of the gallows, treaty map crushed in his fist, face twisted with frustrated rage. All his careful plans, his bought authority, his iron control, they seemed to waver like mirages in the rain. But still Keisha stood. Still the elders witnessed. Still James prayed. Still Maria held her ground. And the thunder rolled. The noose swung like a dark pendulum in the rain. As the hangman reached for it, James's voice cut through the downpour. "Wait." He straightened despite his chains, voice strong with certainty. "Marshal Drennan's lying about that treaty. There's another clause, one he doesn't want you to see." The crowd stirred, pressing closer despite the rain. Water dripped from the brims of men's hats and women's shawls as they strained to hear. "The land and water rights belong to Maria's family line," James called out. "Her husband's service guaranteed it. The railroad has no claim here." Gasps rippled through the gathering. The marshal's face darkened like storm clouds. "You're speaking nonsense, McGraw. This treaty gives the railroad full authority." "Show them the whole document," James demanded. "Show them the part about rights passing to soldiers' widows." Maria stepped forward, reaching into her skirts. She pulled out papers wrapped in oilcloth, protected from the rain. "Here is truth," she declared, her voice carrying across the square. "My husband's army discharge papers signed by the territorial governor himself. His rights to the valley water passed to me and any family I claim as my own." She held the papers high. The preacher descended the gallows steps and took them carefully, examining the official seals and signatures. His eyes widened as he read. "These are genuine," he announced. "Private Santiago's service earned perpetual water rights for his family line." He looked up at Keisha on the platform, then at James in chains. "And if Maria claims them as family?" "That's not possible," Drennan sputtered, rain streaming down his red face. "The railroad's purchase was illegal," Elder Nantan finished firmly. "The land was never yours to sell." The crowd's murmuring grew louder. Someone called out, "The marshal lied to us. He's working for the railroad men." More voices joined in, years of resentment breaking free like a dam giving way. The deputies shifted uneasily, looking to each other for guidance as their authority crumbled. The preacher raised his Bible, commanding attention. "I've seen enough," he declared. "This execution is no act of justice. It's murder meant to steal land from its rightful owners." He turned to face James, Maria, and Keisha. "Before God and these witnesses, I recognize and bless this union. 2 wives James has claimed, and 2 wives he shall protect, for their bond was forged in mercy's fire and tempered by heaven's grace." Lightning flashed as if in divine confirmation. The rain fell harder, soaking the gallows wood, turning the crowd's footing treacherous in the mud. "You can't do this," Drennan's voice cracked with desperation. "I am the law here." "The law serves justice, Marshal," the preacher replied firmly, "not railroad greed." More townspeople spoke up now. "Free Keisha, somebody cut her down. Let McGraw loose." The deputies looked to Drennan, waiting for orders, but his authority was dissolving like paper in the rain. The treaty map in his hands had become a sodden mess, ink running in dark streams between his fingers. Maria climbed the gallows steps head high. No one moved to stop her as she reached Keisha and began untying her bonds. James stood watching, rain mixing with tears of relief on his face. The crowd's mood had shifted decisively. Where before they'd gathered for an execution, now they pressed forward with purpose, surrounding Drennan and his men. The marshal's hand twitched toward his gun, but a dozen stern faces warned against it. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," the preacher said, raising his voice above the storm. "Today we've witnessed his mercy triumph over injustice. Let no man tear asunder what God has joined together." Thunder punctuated his words as Maria helped Keisha down from the gallows. Someone rushed forward with keys taken from a deputy, unlocking James's chains. The three came together in an embrace, heedless of the rain that soaked them all. The marshal stood alone now, his deputies having stepped back to merge with the crowd. The carefully constructed web of lies and greed that had given him power lay in ruins, washed away by truth and rain and the courage of three hearts bound together by love and mercy. Marshal Drennan's face twisted with rage. "Hang her anyway," he bellowed at his deputies. "That's an order." But as the deputies moved forward, townspeople stepped between them and the gallows. Women in wet shawls linked arms with men in mud-spattered boots. The crowd pressed closer, forming a human wall. Railroad enforcers drew their revolvers with metallic clicks. "Stand aside," they warned. The Apache warriors stood their ground, arrows knocked. Elder Nantan raised his chin defiantly. The rain drummed harder on the wooden platform as both sides faced each other, neither willing to back down. Suddenly, a blinding flash split the sky. Lightning struck a telegraph pole just yards away, sending sparks showering down. Horses reared in terror, throwing their riders. Men scattered in panic as thunder cracked overhead, like God's own judgment. Deputies dropped their guns in the mud, backing away. "I won't shoot my neighbors," one declared, others nodding in agreement. Marshal Drennan's face drained of color. With a curse, he turned and fled through the rain, his authority shattered like the smoking telegraph pole. James rushed to the gallows, yanking the noose away from Keisha's neck. He pulled her close, sheltering her with his body as Maria embraced them both. A cheer went up from the crowd, rising above the storm. The preacher raised his hands in blessing. Faith and justice restored to Silver Bluff at last. Evening settled over Silver Bluff like a soft blanket, the storm giving way to gentle rain that pattered against the shack's tin roof. Inside, lamplight cast warm shadows as James, Maria, and Keisha huddled close, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and relief. The door creaked open as townswomen arrived bearing steaming dishes and fresh-sewn quilts. "You showed us what real courage means," whispered Sarah Miller, setting down a pot of chicken stew. Others nodded, laying colorful quilts across the bed and table. James sat Maria down gently by the stove, his weathered hands careful as he dabbed at the purple bruise blooming on her cheekbone. "Hold still now," he murmured, applying witch hazel that one of the women had brought. Maria winced but managed a tired smile. Across the room, Keisha's shoulders shook with quiet sobs. The terror of the day finally spilled out as she sank onto a kitchen chair. I truly thought." She couldn't finish, but Maria reached out and caught her hand. "We're together," Maria said softly. "That's what matters now." A knock at the door announced Preacher Williams, his hat clutched in his hands. Rain dripped from his coat as he stepped inside, face drawn with remorse. "I come seeking your forgiveness," he said, voice thick with emotion. "I let fear cloud my judgment when I should have stood for God's love." He looked at each of them in turn. "Your family is blessed in his eyes, and I pledge to defend it before any who question." James nodded solemnly. "We're grateful, preacher." "Shall we pray together?" the preacher asked. They knelt in a circle on the rough wooden floor, hands clasped tight. Keisha's fingers trembled in James's grip, while Maria's remained steady and warm. Outside, rain continued to fall, washing the dust from the valley as Preacher Williams' voice rose in humble thanks. "Lord, we thank you for your deliverance," he prayed, "for showing us that love knows no bounds, and that your mercy extends to all who seek shelter in your grace." "Amen," they whispered together, the word carrying all their gratitude and hope. Through the window they could see the rain-cleansed valley stretching toward tomorrow, their home now truly their own. The valley bloomed under summer sun weeks after the Marshals' defeat. Morning dew sparkled on green shoots pushing through rich soil where rotting survey stakes lay forgotten in the mud. The railroad company, its schemes exposed, had withdrawn in disgrace, leaving only whispered tales of their defeat. James wiped sweat from his brow as he worked the plow, while Maria and Keisha followed behind, dropping corn kernels into the freshly turned earth. Their laughter echoed across the fields, startling meadowlarks into flight. "You're planting them too close," Maria teased, reaching down to adjust Keisha's spacing. "I reckon I'll never be the farmer you are," Keisha replied with a smile, her voice carrying none of its old fear. James paused to watch them, his heart full. The sight of them working together, teaching each other, filled him with quiet joy. "You're both doing fine," he called, leading the horse to the next row. By afternoon, children gathered at their cabin door, drawn by the promise of Keisha's lessons. She had arranged rough-hewn benches under the oak tree, where she taught reading and numbers. Her dream of starting a proper school grew stronger with each eager face. "Teacher," a small girl called, holding up a slate, "did I write it right?" Keisha bent to check the child's work, praise flowing easily now. Nearby, Maria worked with older children, showing them which plants could heal and which to avoid. Her gentle instructions carried the wisdom of two cultures, preserved now for another generation. James hammered at new fence posts, expanding their garden plot. The steady rhythm of his work matched the peaceful buzz of learning behind him. Each post driven deep felt like another root securing their unusual family to this land. As evening painted the sky in amber and rose, the three settled onto their porch. Inside, lamplight cast a warm glow through windows, and the scent of Maria's stew drifted out. Their hands found each other naturally now, fingers intertwined in quiet understanding. Through town, people spoke of them with growing respect. "That's the mountain man who chose both wives to save them." The story passed from mouth to mouth, growing into legend, a tale of courage, mercy, and faith that would echo through generations. They had become living proof that love could defy boundaries, that family could grow from the soil of sacrifice and trust. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.